Hi, we continue in Genesis 17 today as God empowers Abraham with a new name as Abraham and also relation to children and land. And we'll see that the consequences of this passage are not limited to the immediate scene here in Genesis 17, but echo out into the rest of the history of the Bible and to the history of Israel and Palestine to this day, as we'll see. So, interpretation of some of the details of these verses are very important to keep in mind the broader narrative context of Genesis as primarily an exilic text proposing an alternative to the Babylonian Enuma Elish. In other words, as a primal text in what I've been calling for years now the religion of creation, in contrast with the anarchical imperial stories which operate under the religion of empire. So we'll have to look at that more closely as we go. Last time we looked at what you see on the right side of the screen, the various ways of structuring this chapter, and I won't look at it in great detail today, other than to say that we're in this second speech here today, which parallels the fourth speech on the other side of Wenham's proposed chiasm. But as we noted last time, and I won't repeat it all again here, that both the chiasm and the parallel panels suffer from selective structuring. There are verses missing in both. You see verse 18 is missing here, and verse 8 is missing here. And so that's why Paul Williamson, who did his doctoral dissertation on the relationship between the covenants in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17, proposes much more simply just the series of calls and responses. But however we hear it, we're going to be on verses 5 to 8 today, really continuing from verse 4. Either way we look at it, God's first speech to Abraham here, offering him a new name. So it begins here, and let's look at some details, then we'll look at some other aspects of how this relates to later in Genesis and later in the Bible. As Sarna notes about this general principle, giving a name is connected in the ancient Near East with creativity, which is to say not just with power over, but with some power to create, and that's exactly what's being given here. The phrase in English here, no longer shall your name be Abram, reverses the way the Hebrew works. So you can see in my note down below yakare od, literally, and not called always. So it's not that it will no longer be called Abram, it won't always be called Abram, but it shall be Abraham. And as Hagar renamed Yahweh, now Yahweh renames Abram. And we'll also see later in the chapter that Sarai becomes Sarah. And we'll see later in the book that Jacob becomes Israel. And in all of those, there's an empowerment about a relationship that relates to the name itself and to the direction the character is going. So here, Abraham, we hear, it goes to father of many or father of a multitude from father of the lofty. You see the entire Hebrew phrase, Abraham ki, Ab Haman, Goyim Metaika. So Ab Haman, father of a multitude. But in the playful way the Midrash does, we hear this changing the names. The letter Yod, which is the little hook that looks like that sounds like a Y in English, with a numerical value of 10, was taken from Sarai's name, the I here, and split into two He's, which is an H sound, each of which has a numerical value of 5, one for her and one for him. So Abraham and Sarah get the two Hes split from the letter Yod taken from Sarah's name. And that's the kind of playful thing that the Midrash often does, not only attributing numerical things, but attributing intention, as we see in this later one here, quoted from Judith Antonelli. The letter Yod was upset at being withdrawn from the name of that righteous woman, so God had to promise the Yod to use it later in Joshua's name. And again, I hope if you're a Christian watching this, you can enjoy the playful nature of working with this that the Jewish tradition has always had, not taking it so heavily seriously as the Platonic philosophers, who had very little sense of humor, as far as I can tell, did, that turned this into a search for doctrine rather than stories about people struggling to live and have sex and children, etc. So the name is now Abraham, for the rest of the time father of a multitude, and now it's explained, as these etymologies often are, for I've made you, or literally I'm giving you. And as Westerman notes, it's political language, someone who's installed in office by a sovereign. And that fits, as we were seeing here, and I'll put it up here, the shape of this, using the key words, the paragraphs of this, as if it's someone issuing contract terms. So as for me, and next time we'll see as for you, as for Sarah, your wife, and later we'll see as for Ishmael, who's not within the covenant, but is being given a statement there. So, made you the father of a multitude of nations. Father here. And of a multitude of nations. So, Ab Haman here. A double entendre can mean father of a crowd, but Haman can also mean father of agitation. And it's interesting play on words there. So, I jumped over this here a little bit. Made several times in this section is really Natan, for to give, and I've highlighted I'm giving you a number of times that we can see here. So, it makes for awkward English. I'm giving you the answer ancestor doesn't make sense, but I'm giving you to become the father of nations. In other words, it's not something that Yahweh is described as giving, doing as much as giving. But when I mention Yahweh, we have to note here that this is Elohim speaking here. And in fact, we heard earlier that it was Yahweh up here appeared as El Shaddai. So to the extent that scholars want to play with sources and attribute every time it says Lord in all caps here, which is Yahweh in Hebrew, to the so-called J source, and when it says Elohim here to the E or the P source, as more modern scholarship has noted, that is increasingly falling apart as an artificial attempt to separate what some editor has put together. So we don't worry about whether Elohim is different from Yahweh here, but it's literally Elohim who's doing the speaking here, even though the chapter said Yahweh began to speak to Abram. So I will give you to be exceedingly fruitful. And I want to look more closely at this language too, because the Hebrew here, I won't read the whole Hebrew to you, but the phrase literally is, and to be fruitful, which is a verb here. Fruitful is a verb, so it doesn't look like a verb in English here. It looks like something you become. I give you great power. In other words, instead of I will give you children or I will give you offspring, I will make you powerfully fruitful, or give you exceeding power to be fruitful. Whether that's to say your sperm will be more powerful or whatever that could understand, there would be a lot of life in you that will bring life to others. And it's a power. So it's up to Abraham, now Abraham, to use it. It's not that God is doing it to him. He's giving him something that he can use if he chooses to. And of course, it will result in Isaac. And later, to surprise, it will result in a whole bunch more children from another wife after Sarah dies. But that's later in the story. And I will make nations of you here. And as Westermann notes, the word pair's primary setting is the late prophecy of salvation. But again, that's the older way of looking at it. I don't think we need to see it that way nowadays. And now we get to the crucial phrase that I really want to focus on. And king shall come from you. And as my note here suggests, as Sarna notes, a Jewish scholar from a previous generation, but not that long ago, the Davidic dynasty is the fulfillment of this promise. And similarly, Williamson notes that the narrator, quote, sharpens the focus in Genesis 17 to a royal line of Abraham's seed. But I want to argue strongly against that, and to do that, I want to do a couple of things here. I want to raise some issues involving this interpretation between Genesis 17 and Psalm 72:17, which is what's at issue here. So as scholars have noted, there are a couple of times where this issue of kings coming from you is found. Once in Genesis 35, which I put here, so that's also within our context of Genesis and almost the exact same phrase. But then in Psalm 72, may all nations be blessed in him, which is to say the king. And that's led many scholars to make this incredible leap to say from this statement here that Genesis is somehow pointing to fulfillment in the Davidic dynasty. And as I hinted at last time, I think it's exactly and precisely the opposite. And the basis for that, the question for that, is this interpretive principle. When do common words or phrases suggest common perspective, and when do they suggest opposing perspective? So in this case, I'd like to suggest that the king's coming from you is not something to be praised, but something to be concerned about. As I looked last time, the parallels, some of which Williamson notes in his dissertation, but we can look at here, between Genesis 15 covenant and Genesis 17 covenant, is the way they're structured. And so there's a promise at the beginning of uncountable descendants. There's a prediction of something bad happening, as I'm interpreting it, and that's followed by a statement of the covenant and a promise of land. So if these are not parallel, then what is that doing there? Plainly, in the Genesis 15 one, this is plainly negative. This is about the Exodus in Egypt, and it names words like oppression for 400 years, and Yahweh will bring judgment on the nations they serve. So this one is plainly negative, and there's no question about that. But it's interesting to me how few scholars, I've not found any, who see this as the parallel it seems obviously to be here. And part of the basis for that, and we'll look at our issues involved here, is both the role of kings in Genesis, but the interpretive principles involved. And so, look, I won't spend a lot of time looking at Psalm 72, but Psalm 72 is plainly a royal psalm that associates the king with providing social justice for the poor. And as many scholars have noted, I want to highlight 3 recent articles from scholars who have focused on these issues and where they're coming from. This one from Andrew Mean, and this is in Bangalore Journal, so he's writing in the context of India. And this one here from Dita Vaj, who is a professor professor, among other places, at the University of the Free State in South Africa, and this one here from Walter Houston in England. And all three of these are noting how Psalm 72 is a function of imperial ideology, as you see in the title of this one, even the imperial legacy of Psalm 72, which is to say it's providing exactly what I've traditionally been calling, in my work, the religion of empire, a divine justification for why kings rule in the name of whatever God it is. And in that sense, Psalm 72 is no different than Enuma Elish or Egyptian or Assyrian or Roman or any other imperial religion that claims that the God that the people worship has empowered the king to give the people what they want, which is to say social justice on the ground and national security. And Genesis, from the very beginning, is the exact opposite of that. And I won't go back through all my videos, but as we saw from the start, that the giving of human beings collectively and the divine image is highlighting that the power that God has is not focused on one person as a king, but on all human beings collectively to have responsibility over the earth. And we also saw, of course, that the Garden of Eden was the opposite of a city, and the first city in Genesis 4 was created by Cain, the first murderer who was alienated from God. And then we saw Abram at that time's fear of lack of food and going to the supply chain that was Egypt. And we'll see that all the way in the end when 13 chapters worth of that happens with Joseph, who leads his family contrary to Yahweh's will to land in Canaan, which we'll see in this passage, but to land in Egypt. And so from the very beginning to the end, however many different sources there might be in Genesis, and however much time period it was written, it is completely anti-city, anti-empire, and therefore anti-monarchy. And what we notice here is the phrase "kings come from you" does not say, "I will make that happen." So that's one of the issues here that is highlighting on the end. "I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you" is a passive voice here. So let's look at this just a little more closely here. So I noted the issue of the time of composition. That's one of the issues that I'm surprised that scholars don't seem to address here, as if Genesis and the Psalm were of one sequence. But as one of those sources noted, Psalm 72 has become increasingly understood as a Davidic psalm, not because of its original form, but because of the final verses that were added to it as a colophon, and plainly added later, probably not even directed to the audience, but directed to singers and others, that associated with David, and associated with David saying it to his son, which made it associated with Solomon. But in its original, through verse 17, there's no specification. It may well have been a generic psalm that couldn't be sung over any king, whether to celebrate the king in his inauguration or throughout his monarchy. So therefore, we can conclude fairly the authors of the psalm didn't know Genesis. In other words, they weren't praising this king, whether an unnamed king or Solomon, because it was fulfillment of Genesis 17, but just on its own. And that it reaches this conclusion here that I've been saying so far, that Genesis is completely negative about human kings and Psalm 72 is completely positive. So I really want to highlight that here. This is no exception to, in the Genesis mind, this is a warning that kings shall come, and therefore all the more reason that you should live the way that Yahweh is telling you how to live here, rather than to live the way you live with kings. And we saw that just recently in chapter 14, when we saw how Abram had to gather an army of 318 to rescue Lot, and how the kings wanted to buy him off at the end, and he would have nothing to do with it. So I hope that much is clear. I've not put a note in the comments, and we can talk about it further. So let's go down to the rest of what Yahweh is doing here to empower Abraham in this context, the newly named Abraham. So, as we know below, the Hebrew word order makes two parallel statements linked by Zera Achari, which is to say your seed after you. And we see that phrase here, offspring after you, and offspring after you here. So, I will establish my covenant. Literally, it's I will make it stand, my covenant here. Extended from the meaning of verse 4 in terms of promise. Now it's mutual. It's between me and you. And the Hebrew bind for between is repeated 3 times in a row, between me and between you and between your seed. But it's 3 times in a row to highlight the interactivity of the nature of the covenant. So between your seed after you, a phrase that is repeated many times and is redundant in a way scholars have noted as unnecessary. Plainly, your offspring come after you. So why the phrase after you, other than to highlight that this is meant to be eternal? And it's said 3 ways: after you, throughout their generations, and everlasting. All to emphasize that this is not just as long as it works or subject to your behavior, but something Yahweh is committing to forever, which raises some serious problems historically, as we'll address just briefly in a moment. And it's a covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. which is to say, Elohim's here's promise to be God to the offspring is independent of whether the offspring choose Elohim as their God. Just that God's promise unilaterally to do that, open to the possibility. And of course, from the beginning, we've known each person has the freedom to choose whether to be in relation to Yahweh or not, as we saw in the Cain story early on. And so further here, the promise of land as Westermanno's structure is subordinated to the promise of offspring in the divine presence. And the land issue is not as clear as it might seem, as we'll look at compared to earlier things. So the land where you are now an alien. And that phrase is used a number of times, as we can see here. The word for alien here is not gur, it's mugger, a slightly variation on it. This is a grammatical variation on that. Gur was like Hagar, Hagar, the alien or the foreigner, the immigrant. And so this land in which you are now an alien is all the land of Canaan. And we'll see in chapter 19 that will be parallel to Lot in the land of Sodom, where although he's lived there for many years now, by the time that chapter happens, the Sodomites declare him to be an alien and challenge him for attempting to act like he's their brother. So the land where you are now an alien, he's been there, as we saw, for over 13 years in the land of Canaan, and it's now been 24 years since they left when he was 75. All the land of Canaan. But the question is, how much is the land of Canaan? And if we look at this map here, it's nicely misleading in the sense there are no boundaries. The word for Canaan is a generic word which literally means a land of traders, not traitors, like people are unfaithful to the government, people who trade. And so it's like saying Indian country. But we know that the land of Canaan contains the land of many specific people, some of whom are mentioned here, Amalekites and Amorites, but there are many others who are mentioned here, like Philistines and others. And so what is this land of Canaan, which it says Yahweh will give you? And of course, the pregnant problem here is, what about the people who are already in the land, Philistines or other people described generically as Canaanites? Genesis does not participate in what Joshua and Deuteronomy do, which is the idea that these other peoples are like a virus or an infection that you can't get anywhere near and you have to destroy or it will destroy you. And we'll see how Genesis provides an alternative strategy for how to live around these people. But it will not be by killing them. It will not be by having a king and a war and taking the land from them. It will be by more subtle means, as we'll see. And it particularly be formed around this phrase perpetual holding, olam achuvah here, which will come up in chapter 23, which is when Abraham will negotiate to purchase a piece of land as a perpetual holding in which to bury Sarah, and which will be the burial place for him and his descendants after him, in the cave of couples, as we'll see. So in other words, the first way that this promise of God giving this land to them will be fulfilled is through purchase. Through using the silver that Abraham has gotten through other means. Otherwise, what was the use of his silver? He can't eat it, can he? And so we'll end there with this perpetual holding, and I will be their God, and it will continue, as we saw next time, with the response for Abraham, and this is where it will involve what we've known was waiting all along, the circumcise the flesh of your foreskins. We'll get to that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.